Go. All right. So I'm Jeremy, uh, and this is Seth. So if
Hey,
you're watching this video and you know Seth, I'll introduce myself and I'll let Seth introduce himself. We know each other through taking classes together in graduate school for what some people call seminary school, which is a fancy word for like a place where Christian leaders learn things like studying the Bible and yeah, I mean other things like the history of the movement we call Christianity and other things like that. I don't remember what all we learned, but Seth was one of my classmates. We were probably classmates 4, 5, 6 years ago, and yeah, and we recently stumbled across. I forget how. Probably on Facebook, we saw that we both really enjoyed this new series on the life of Jesus, The Chosen. So we were like, hey, let's talk about it. And so I thought we would just talk about it. And this is our first time talking about it, but we're going to record it so that other people, if they want to hear and like glean some of the thoughts, and maybe it's a free marketing for these people that are made this. But anyways, yeah, obviously we both love Jesus and we want others to know Jesus. But we also have a little bit of more of a like academic scholarly bent, I guess, because we went to school, graduate school, to study about Jesus. And so I thought it'd be fun to just have this interaction. So yeah, Seth, go ahead and introduce yourself.
definitely. Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, so I'm Seth, and yeah, I'm a Bible teacher right now, kind of like a youth pastor or at a church, but it's at a little private school up in Bucks County called Plumstead Christian School. And what I do right now is I just teach the Bible to middle school and high school students. I've got seventh grade, eighth grade, ninth grade, and 12th grade every day. And I've been doing that for 4 years now, so I love it. And I really enjoy studying the Bible, and especially with kids because they ask great questions and they really get me thinking. So yeah, when I saw this series, The Chosen, I was really excited because I mean I'm always skeptical at first, and it really took a while for me to actually catch on to it. I actually had a few friends that recommended it, and it wasn't until the other Bible teacher at Plumstead recommended it that I was like, oh, okay, this is for real. He's such a wise mentor of mine. So so when he recommends something, I kind of take note. But Jeremy, you were just saying too, who introduced you to the show?
Yeah, yeah, I think it was my wife. I think she saw. So this is a crowdfunding series, right? And so I think she saw a episode that they had filmed before they even filmed. Right now, there's 8 episodes, and it's like a first season.
Right.
But before they had even filmed the whole first season, I think there was like this preview trailer that was, I think, the Christmas story. Like it was like almost like a 5-10 minute clip,
Okay.
and it was really pretty compelling. So she had just talked about, oh yeah, this is interesting, and then they're like crowdfunding to produce the series, and she's like, oh yeah, we should look forward to that. But I actually ended up seeing it um, and online, and then watched it like before the coronavirus hit. Actually, I think it was like early this year, maybe January, February, that I watched it, and I have a similar reaction to you. So for me, when I see Jesus stuff, I kind of have an allergic reaction to anything super Christian, like when it comes to media stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, Probably unfairly so. It's like growing up as a believer within Christian culture. So whether it's movies, well, even music. I mean, anything like that just starts with out of Christian culture. I tend to usually be like, um, and so but my interest in it usually is more, "Hey, I should check this out because probably people will be influenced by this." So I think I first went for it like that, and um, I'm curious, Seth. Besides the recommendation,
Yes.
you know, but when you first saw this series, and none of us are saying it's perfect, right? But I think we'll talk about some different things in it. But I'm curious what first made you intrigued or like interested in it, because there's some things for me, but I want to hear your reaction first, or like what drew you in to say, oh, I haven't seen a depiction of Jesus like that before, or like of the story. Real quick, first, The Chosen
Yeah.
it actually mainly focuses on. It's not just focusing on Jesus, and it's not just focusing on the text of the Gospels. The story, it's a creative adaptation, but it's actually focusing on more so on his disciples, um, and the story of how they come to follow Jesus, at least up to this point in the first season. So not all of the scenes have Jesus, um, and of course, because of that, a lot of the stuff is just totally made up, right? I mean, they try to do stuff that would be plausible given their research of the characters and the history and the background. But yeah, anyways, that's the backdrop. But I'm curious about what drew you in with these episodes.
Yeah, that's a good point. Oh man, it's a good question. So after I got the recommendation, actually my initial reaction, I think I saw it on social media as well, and I was kind of like, oh, that's weird, you know. It's new, and it kind of reminded me of, I think there was like a History Channel like TV show that came out recently, and I never even really watched the whole thing because I kind of got sick of it, and sort of like the allergic reaction thing you mentioned, I totally feel the same way. I think a lot of times Christian media is kind of just like too obvious, and it's kind of like evangelical. They're like trying to really save souls, which that's a good thing, but at the same time, for me, it oftentimes it ends up being a little bit kind of boring. Um, but for this one, I was curious because it seemed like they were trying to do something new. And when I looked into it a little bit more after that recommendation, I think what intrigued me was that they were purposefully trying to be creative. They were purposely trying to, I don't know about fill in the gaps so that we know the right answers about Jesus more. Like it wasn't more like that. It was more like you said, like they're trying to take interpretive clues and use some historical information to kind of fill in the gaps and to better understand some of the characters in the New Testament. So it's funny though, because other than that, I had like no context going into the show. Like it wasn't until like I just started watching it during the coronavirus. And honestly, a big motivation for me was I really just wanted to spend some more time getting like a fresh interaction with Jesus.
Yeah,
I mean, honestly, it was kind of a personal, uh, spiritual type thing for me
yeah,
because I'm not in crisis necessarily personally. I'm not desperate for something new or anything like that. But I'm always reading my Bible. I'm always enjoying that, studying the Bible, teaching the Bible. I just taught through the New Testament with a group of ninth graders, and we did an in-depth study. Um, but I really feel this I guess it's this desire in my heart that as you read about Jesus, you still want to know him more. You still are left with this feeling of, I wonder what it would be like if he walked into the room
yeah,
right now, and so there's still tons of questions about who Jesus is and what it would be like to be with him
yeah.
even after studying the New Testament. So I think that was really like, it was perfect timing for me that, oh, now I've got hours on end to watch something new. I get the recommendation and I'm going for it.
I mean, that's cool because I mean, that's the way Scripture is designed, right? It's supposed to lead us to desire to know Jesus, and there's a temptation for those of us who study the Scriptures to then be driven only to want to know more about the Bible, or to like just stay caught in this kind of cognitive mode rather than if the Bible is a story that is intending to lead to Jesus and like us personally knowing him, right?
Right.
And following him, and be drawn into his story. You know, for me, some of the stuff that really, okay, I wrote down a couple things right before I jumped on the call because
Okay.
what is it that,
That's
because
good.
I wanted to say, what is it that really made this stuff fascinating me? I think it's a couple things. So
Yeah.
the creative adaptation, yes, where it's like, oh, interesting, right? I didn't think about, I wouldn't have thought about, so I think it was like episode 3. The whole thing is just before he ends up meeting with his disciples
It's
and
amazing. Yeah.
but I think is it episode 3 where he's just hanging out with a bunch of kids,
With
right?
the kids. Yep.
And what it is like he's by himself and he's like someone's preparing, and he's kind of out in this wilderness area, um, and these kids kind of stumble across him and they end up bringing the other kids. And what I find beautiful is I think they pick up on something that Jesus, the Gospels all depict Jesus as having a favorable view of children, and also saying, unless you become like a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of God, and things like that. And so it even shows them the boys studied the Torah, you know, they understand these things, they test their knowledge, but more so, you know, he teaches them some things, but they get it, right?
Yeah.
And it shows that they're more open and and just it shows his natural affection for children, right?
Yes.
But also there's this, I think they did really well. There's this part where like they show that he's like not some creepy man with the kids, you know, like that he, you know, he makes it careful, like, hey, you know, I could be a bad man, so you got to be careful, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that was just, to me, that suddenly I was like, I don't think I've ever seen a story with Jesus depicting Jesus spending time with children, you know, where
Right.
he enjoys that. And you think about, where did that come from? When Jesus is teaching his disciples, right? In his normal life. So I guess it just takes Jesus and gives this full-bodied humanity to him, right? Which we believe Jesus is fully divine, fully human, whatever that means. It does mean at least this, that he lived a real human life. And so you think about, where did this idea of him loving children and wanting his disciples to treat children in a special way come from? That you have to think about, well, it must have happened some experiences in his life, right?
Right.
And this was an imaginative thing for me. I was like, wow, that's very plausible, right? And there was a girl in the episode who was like poor, and then he ends up making like these toys for her that she wouldn't have done. And it's like, oh, this just integrates with the Jesus we have depicted in the Gospels. So it's things like that, right? I think creativity, filling in things that wouldn't be in the text necessarily, but is consistent with it, and filling out his humanity, Jesus' humanity. I'm curious if there's, I mean, like there's more things like that, right? Or keep going, but yeah, I mean.
Yeah, it's funny that you started with episode 3 because honestly, I've had a decent amount of conversations about episode 3 so far. I think that one is a perfect example to kind of start this conversation with, because just like you said, you know, it takes maybe 1 or 2 verses from the New Testament story that Jesus tells us to be like children, and he welcomes the little children. He tells the disciples, you know, don't send them away. And it just kind of gives a whole narrative episode about, okay, so what does this mean about Jesus? What would he be like in some of those scenes that we don't see in the Gospels? You know, and I think when I first came to the series, this is a very typical seminary student thing, and maybe evangelical, just Christian in general. I don't know for sure. But it's definitely my first knee-jerk reaction a lot of times is to kind of look for inaccuracies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like as soon as I see you know, the white rock star Jesus in most other shows, I'm like, oh, that's not accurate, you know, and I immediately am kind of turned away from some of that stuff. And
It's a understandable and probably important impulse, at least one way of interacting with it, right?
absolutely, absolutely. And part of that, I think, comes from if you claim to be trying to teach me something that's all about accuracy, then I'm going to play that game with you and
Right.
I'm going to show you where it's inaccurate, you know? So I think a lot of shows, a lot of movies, a lot of series, they are really focused on trying to depict what we know from scripture as accurately as possible. And that's a good thing. But again, what this show does so well is kind of take a creative approach to seeing um, scenes that might not be right there for the taking, but that could have very well happened.
Right.
So that third episode, I think, is really the one that has stuck with me the most so far. I'm kind of an emotional person in general, but that episode really struck a chord with me. I'm sitting there, honestly, I'm sitting there for like a good 30 minutes of that episode in tears.
Yeah.
But for two reasons. And I actually wanted to mention something too. The other teacher and I have been talking a little bit, and he mentioned episode 3 as well. He kept feeling like, this is just worth thinking about as well. He kept feeling like when he was watching this episode that something terrible was going to happen.
Hmm.
And it's funny that you mentioned, you know, Jesus kind of shows that he's not a creep along the way. But I think that's worth kind of mentioning. I had that a little bit at the beginning, kind of this feeling of uneasiness, which I think is justified, and it comes partly from our culture, our experience of an adult with children
Scary.
is a scary thing,
Mhm.
right? And we know that there are some problems there. And the children,
On Christian culture, right? I mean, you think about all the pastors and all the
yes,
spiritual leaders that end up spiritual abuse and all that, and
yes.
right.
And I think you're right in that the episode kind of leads up to that tension at the beginning, especially where you're like, okay, what's going to happen here? And the other Bible teacher kept mentioning, like, the mom kept telling the one girl, like, don't play in the water. And so he was like, he told me he was like freaking out that like she's going to drown, she's going to die, like something terrible is going to happen to these kids. And so he really didn't enjoy the episode. And I was like, you got to watch it again, man. Because as I was watching it, I had that feeling at first, but I think what they do really beautifully is Jesus, he doesn't coerce them, and he's just kind of showing what it means to be a godly, righteous man interacting with these children. And at first, the children are definitely tense, and they don't just come running up to hug this guy, as they shouldn't, right? But they are curious, and they see his character. They listen to his words. You know, they come back, and sometimes I think they tell some other friends, and maybe they tell their parents at the end of the episode or something like that. But I just love how Jesus shows what it means to be a true man and teacher with these children.
Yeah, I want to jump on that. So like a lot of Jesus shows, when I think of the person that is there, just the emotional expressions, the scenes. I mean, there's not a lot of variety, right? So they
Yeah.
tend to do just Bible passage scenes, and they want to get right what he said and stuff. So it's very didactic, or it's teaching oriented, or whatever. So you have a couple exceptions. Jesus wept, right, in like in front of Lazarus' story, those kind of moments. But a lot of them, because of that, it's almost like it feels like you have a Jesus that sort of is this like divine figure that just kind of floats above the reality of the scenes that he's in.
Yeah.
But there's something about that moment, right, where it's like, no, Jesus is there responding and interacting. And you said godly, righteous man. And it's like, what is godliness and righteousness? What is holiness? What does God present here in this moment look like? Right? And it looks like this man who is, like you're saying, not coercing, but like welcoming, but finding a way to do it in a way that's appropriate and showing warmth and care, and it's, for me, I think that that's healing,
Yeah.
right? It's like, because it's so healing because you don't see like Jesus, like Jesus enters into the stories that we're used to, and it's supposed to go this way. Oh no, something bad's gonna happen, you know, and then he heals it and brings it back in the right direction, you know.
Yes.
And I see, and you know, other parts you see his, like his you see the wrestling, the feeling of like tension, you know.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, I don't know if you remember this episode where Matthew, they depict him so interestingly. They depict him as like Asperger's, you know, or like
Yeah, kind of
autistic, you know, very exacting, you know.
yeah.
And that's interesting how they would think of Matthew, like one of the most Jewish gospels. And he was that way. But he's like, the disciples are like passing by his tax collector's booth, and then they show him as like a pariah, you know, like people hate him because he's a tax collector. But he just gives a glance, and this Matthew figure sees him, catches him, giving him, and then like, but the way he's looking at him, you know, and as he's walking by, and it's like he's totally given life through that. You know, you see how it's just like, whoa. And then like when he ends up, I don't know, I guess this whole thing is a spoiler alert, right? We should just say
Yeah, we should tell spoiler alert at the beginning, but yeah, totally.
when he ends up following him, right? We know from the Gospels, if you've read the Gospels, when Matthew ends up following Jesus, it's like, it's plausible, but it's also powerful, right? It's this thing with like, I guess what it is showing is like different people followed Jesus for different motivations, right?
Right.
And you know, I know you and I have both studied this, right? Like a lot of, you say Christian evangelicals are like, there's a script for how we think people become a Christian, right? You have like a conversion moment, a feeling, whatever. But you know, we've studied like it's not like that, right? It's just like everyone has their own story, and not some people start following before they believe, you know. But what I find interesting is there's steps of transformation, almost like for Matthew, it's almost like, how can you dignify me? I've never been dignified in that way, you know. At least that's how the picturing, and so that's a very plausible, like, wow, this Jesus, this rabbi, this like guy that's being respected, like he's giving his status to me, you know.
Yeah.
And then just the way for other characters, like I guess it shows it's not above, it's not some like abstract thing, you know, which I found very compelling, and I found very believable depiction of how it would be like that one of these disciples would end up following Jesus, you know.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I love that too. Sorry, I'm moving around a lot, but I love that too, how Jesus is approachable, and he has emotion, and he, you know, he even tells a few jokes along the way in this series, in this show, which again, we could definitely debate about that sort of thing as Christians. Is he sort of this holy high figure that sort of stoically walks about the earth, or is he like this Jesus who is friendly and telling jokes along the way and welcoming people? At the very least, I feel like it's a heart's desire of mine that I want him to be like this, you know? And so, in a way, I believe that it's true. I believe that it's accurate in that way.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like you said too, it's refreshing and it's life-giving when you see that, because in a way it's like, this is very close to the Jesus that I know and that I kind of personally came to faith in. And so sometimes when you
Yeah,
see other
also
depictions,
dances at that. He also like dances at that the, you know, the wedding of Cana. Like, tries to get the other disciples to jump in and dance too, and like messes with
yeah,
the guy that's not a good dancer.
right.
Uh,
And like, again, it's funny things like that that we get caught up on. You know, Jesus would never do this in our world. And so I think sometimes we get caught in this feeling of uh Jesus is sort of judging my life, and he doesn't like what he sees. And so it leads us to a relationship that's more about fear. It's a relationship um that's about kind of pleasing him and doing right. um but this Jesus that's being depicted in this show, and I think in a way that's accurate to the Gospels, is actually gracious. You know, he's actually kind. He is someone that you want to be around.
Right.
And yeah, he enjoys life, and he celebrates at appropriate times. And
But not weak either, right? Not just kind of like this
yeah,
doormat that you can walk all over, because
absolutely.
you sense his yeah, that he, and I'm sure it's going to get more deep into it, right? You know, we haven't gotten to the Jesus in the temple, you know,
Right.
but yeah, like you're saying, right? That this um zest for life almost. You know, I was thinking like if I definitely would make a strong case. I mean, I think there's moments in the Gospels where it's under the subtext that he's being humorous, you know. Um, but I would make a strong case that Jesus can't be full revelation of God if he's not, doesn't have a good sense of humor, or like and appreciate humor. Um, and like, you know, for him to be able to weep well, like if he can express that, then he has the full range of what a healthy emotional life, right?
Right.
And so but it's understandable why people would think that's irreverent, that's whatever. I mean, I would just challenge that view of Jesus where it becomes, I think, a uh, non-human, depersonalized understanding of Jesus is just kind of like an abstraction of like
Yes.
an abstracted righteous person, um, that's just always serious.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe even more than that, um, if your tendency, which I will admit it's probably a tendency of mine,
Hmm.
is to think of Jesus as a legal substitutionary payment method,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
You know, we think of him, we know the end of the story, right? Spoiler alert, as well. But if you think of him as on the cross, stoically accepting his
Right.
his punishment for our sake, then that's a logical conclusion that he's sort of impersonal.
Yeah.
Like that kind of makes it more palatable that he gets tortured and killed, right? But that's definitely something that has come up in the back of my mind, and I think has led to some of that emotion for me, where we would have tremendous emotion, right? Like if a lamb is killed,
Hmm.
one of the things I've just noticed, you know, if I've ever gone to a farm or something, when I see a lamb, I want to pet that lamb. It is so cute and cuddly and like innocent, you know. It would be a tragedy to see that thing, you know, slaughtered and killed. And so in the back of my mind as I'm watching these scenes along the way and just thinking, yes, that Jesus is so kind and so loving.
Yeah.
Part of me feels that kind of wave of the tragedy and the sorrow that comes with he did not deserve what's coming to him, and
Right.
the whole time he knows it's coming.
Right. Right.
and and that's kind of that same thing kind of happens when he sees Matthew, like you said, right? He glances over at Matthew, and most other gospel, you know, when we read the gospel, whenever he sees a disciple, he calls him, and he's with him, right?
Yeah.
But a big question I think that comes up for a lot of people, myself included, is like, why would they just get up and follow, you
Yeah.
know? And what's the backstory, that if there is one, you know, is it really that he just shows up and they're like, okay? Or is there some of that interaction like with Matthew where he's kind of seeing him from a distance every once in a while?
Yeah.
Or Nicodemus is a great one, that is sort of studying and kind of on an academic level, but then also experiential level. They're seeing him pass by and they're learning little bits about him.
Right.
That's a beautiful thing. And in a way, I think we're kind of still, as disciples of Jesus, experiencing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we see
Still
him.
having our own conversion moments where we're like, I
Yeah.
think Jesus is calling me towards more, you know, like for me, it'd be like more generosity or more like um, faith in this kind of situation, or like some part of my life that I haven't given up, you know, and I want to let him transform me. You know, it's like this journey but it's showing these plausible ways that Jesus intersects with their journey and draws them in, right? And yeah, there's so much here. I mean,
Yeah.
like I think about um, I think about the plausible, like, you know, they really do try to show the Jewish dynamics, and I don't even want to try to pretend like I can evaluate that well. I mean, some of it, but even having studied some of it, but you know, like trying to show how morally serious they would take it, like Shabbat, you know, Sabbath, and this idea that of like not fishing on the Sabbath, and just Jesus is thoroughly Jewish, you know. He's not, and when Jesus raised from the dead, and you know, and all that, it's not that he started another religion, right? It's not like we have this perspective that way, but it's more like he was the Messiah that the Jewish, like those people had been waiting for, and then in the book of Acts we have to see the story that he's not only for the Jews, right? And it's opened up, and there's hints in Jesus' life, right? But like it's for the Jews and the Gentiles, like for all people, through the outpouring of the Spirit. But yeah, just this trying to contextualize Jesus within that culture. You know, you see their prayers, right?
Yes.
Uh, um, I don't even. I'm trying to remember the wording, but I think Jews still pray this way. You know, blessed are you, Lord God of the universe. You know, who brings forth bread, or something like that.
Right.
That way that they would pray before, as with. So yeah, just it's fascinating. You know, yeah, I don't know anything else for you that made it some level of believability or some level of intriguing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just throw these out there, and I think we should have another conversation again, just because there's so much. And I'm sure once season 2 drops, we're gonna just be
Yeah.
extremely excited.
Yeah. Again, sure.
But a couple of things I just have to mention while we're here. I, like you said, I don't have a lot of info except for what I've studied about Jewish culture. I was invited one time in my life to a Jewish Orthodox Shabbat meal, and the scene where they have the Sabbath really reminded me of that. You know, it's a family gathering. It's a really good meal. Like there were some guys that kind of wandered in off the street on the Sabbath that Jesus was having in a smaller setting with a mixed crowd of people in a much more poor area of town. But they came in and they're like, "Oh, this is awesome! Like I haven't had a Sabbath in forever, and I'm so excited." And
Yeah, right.
that's definitely how I felt when I went to the Sabbath meal. And again, it's a family meal, so you're enjoying the food, you're enjoying the conversation, and you're enjoying the people that are there. I remember that a few things that I noticed was like, this is just a really great experience. Like I would love to go to another real Shabbat again because it was wonderful. It was a blessing to my life. Um, even though I've only done it once, you know. But I remember one thing that the father did while I was there is he blessed the kids, and they had their memorized passages like the Shema, which the kids recite in episode 3, and Jesus is sort of like blessed by that, you know.
Yeah.
And those prayers that Jesus prays throughout the episodes and the Jewish people pray throughout the episode is kind of a beautiful reminder of sort of the law working out in real life. You know, it has God's word has entered into their hearts, and it's part of their lives. It's part of their culture. And same for Jesus in the episodes. He steps into that, and I thought that was really kind of precious. When he goes to sleep, I think in one scene he prays a familiar Jewish kind of bedtime prayer,
Right.
and I just kind of thought, like, yeah, that makes sense. And again, there's sort of this guilty part of me that's like, I should be praying more, and my prayer life should look like this, or this. But seeing some scenes where Jesus is sort of doing that is a reminder that that's kind of okay, and that's in a way precious to God. I think there were one or two other things. Oh, I really appreciate how Jesus interacts with the Romans, or the Roman influence in the show as well. There's definitely some of that cultural background dynamic where you can see the Romans are in power and the Jewish people are sort of in power too, but there's that tension there. And that's something that's really missed by a lot of people when they read through the Gospels, is they miss all that context. But when you're just sitting here watching it, you see it and you feel it, and it's immediate. And
Right.
I think a lot of pastors and Bible teachers included, they want to express, and they write commentaries and they preach sermons to try to express what that would look like.
Yeah.
It might take me 30 minutes to explain to you,
Yeah.
or to explain to anybody, right? The complicated
power dynamics between these leaders have to kind of be comfortable with these leaders, but then they're really, not really in power. Like, how does that work, and how do these people manage the peace with these people?
Right.
People relate to the Jewish leaders, and
yeah. And you even mentioned, like, the tax collector thing. Like, yeah,
right.
We know tax collectors were hated. Or the leprosy episode was another one where I'm just sitting there weeping because, yes, the leper was completely horrified. I mean, he completely terrified everybody that was around him, because nobody wants to get leprosy. They would have to really make it obvious. And so there's just things like that take forever to explain and to try to get across.
Yeah.
That I really appreciate that this show just it's like a direct.
Yeah, you're gonna, next time you have like a sermon, you have to do, here, let me just show you this clip. This seems plausible to me for how it, and then instead of having to explain all of that, like, imagine that feeling, right? And then imagine Jesus, because you're trying to get people into that headspace when you're
exactly.
Right?
And that leads honestly to, I think, my most controversial point. But at the same time, I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. So it's like, I don't know, like, you might
change your mind next week, but
right, and you might kick my door down as a heretic or something. I've mentioned it to a few people, and it's funny, like, some people's reaction, they don't like it. But I really think of this as, I think it's at least like a commentary, like a visual commentary of the Gospels. Commentaries try to fill in the gaps. Commentaries try to express the culture and explain the background narrative that's going on. Commentaries, we know, take leaps of creative interpretation all the time to try to explain things, and they make their best guesses, or their educated guesses, right? And so I really think it's at least a commentary, but even more, I think that this might be a sign of, like, sort of a new form of translation that's happening with the Bible. I really think about this a lot. Like, a lot of people don't read anymore. They listen, or they watch the news, or they take in a lot of media visually rather than by reading. I'm not necessarily in favor of that. I'm a big reader myself, and I enjoy reading and listening to books. And I don't think that any translation replaces, right, the original book that we have. And so, like, and that's not their goal. But many translations, like the Message or the NLT or several other translations, they tell you up front, they say, we want to make this in understandable terms.
Yeah.
So kind of like what you just said, right? It is easier to show it sometimes than to explain it. It's easier to show it than to write it down and
Like a
explain.
visual,
So
like a midrash, right? Like the
yes,
that commentary, like expansion on, like, take one verse and like maybe sometimes in the biblical text it's very dense and it requires a lot of background knowledge to see, even with these couple words, what it's really saying, and then like let me expand on that with the commentary,
right,
with their I you know I think I'm with that. I mean, I could see any, like, I am for creative adaptations. I think they should continue to happen. um I think of a sermon, which are typically most devout followers of Jesus would consider sermons as okay, but they're all creative, unless you're really just reading text. They all are trying to situate text that was written back here, give us a sense of the context of it, and then resituate it here today to speak a new word for our lives right now. So I see it as always creative, and I see film adaptations and those kind of things as really important. Like, I understand the need for faithfulness and not going too far off and all these kind of things and not deceiving.
right,
But I also think that you can mess up by not being creative, right?
right,
Because God gave us creative minds, and I think that, yeah. So I'm with that. I think that you need to have that sort of a little bit of, in some ways, risk taking. I mean, the Holy Spirit. I think the Holy Spirit gives us a faithfulness to Jesus. Yes.
yeah,
But the Holy Spirit also gives us courage and risk taking, right? Which is what happened when, like, what would the Christian movement be without that risk taking that came with the Holy Spirit? And so,
right,
and for me, I actually, again, it's some white guy from, I think, Texas that created this series, right? And I'm like, immediately, originally I was a little suspicious. He's very like, I'm like, I was just like, hey, is this going to be some, just Christian culture extension, whatever? But as I was looking at it, I've watched some like background stuff, and they've released, during coronavirus, they've released all of these things for free on YouTube.
right,
But I've watched, like, it seems like there's some spiritual movement behind this, like it's really prayerfully done. It seems like some of the actors themselves have come to be drawn to Jesus, whether they're following Jesus or just intrigued by him. So not all of them are believers, which is also, I think, a very interesting move within Christian world, to have actors portraying these people that aren't necessarily themselves Christians, followers of Jesus. So I see a creativity and like a risk taking there behind the series, not just in the actual telling of the story, but in the bits and pieces that I feel like I get a glimpse of behind the scenes, that I'll say I'm fascinated by.
right.
It is intriguing to me, and I wonder, sometimes I wonder, like, like, Jesus is Lord of history. Like, he is still interacting, right? He's still working. He's still God on mission. He's still trying to draw the nations to himself. He's still trying to use us.
Right.
So I wonder, is this an extension of what God is doing?
There you
Um,
go, man.
I mean, it's crowdsourced, right? It's being funded by Christians all over the world. Probably some non-Christians too,
Yeah.
right? Are probably giving money to this. And I wonder, how might God be using this? I don't know. Is that
That's what I'm talking about. I mean, so it gets kind of um, controversial for some groups of people, right? Because I have a good group of friends and know a lot of people that are kind of in the camp of seeking accuracy at all costs and
right?
sacrificing all that creative kind of mumbo jumbo,
Right.
they're the type that want the most accurate Bible translation possible.
Sure.
And as somebody that has studied languages and cares about accuracy as well, I see that that's super important. But I
Yeah.
think at the very least, this is like, I mean, I have like a dozen commentaries over there. I have like even more on my electronic software, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why not have this other type of media that's giving another attempt at explaining a different side. They're definitely getting across things that I couldn't get from a lot of books. They're getting across like emotions. They're showing some of the cultural things that
Yeah.
you don't usually see right away.
Yeah.
They're pushing against some of the biases. Part of me in my, I think, conservative nature is a little concerned. What are they going to do with this power? What are they going to do with this really?
That's real. That's real. Because they could,
Right.
I mean, only one season's been filmed, right?
Right.
Could take it and do a lot of things with it. Yeah. Totally. There's ways to
Exactly.
use the power.
Exactly. So like, again, like my conservative side's like, okay, now that they've really set the stage for this wonderful Jesus who is very accurately portrayed in some new interesting ways, right? Like again, like there's some non-described biblical scenes that they could get into that get pretty tricky,
Yeah.
And when you're talking about Jesus, that's serious. That's pretty important.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I think, I trust the Holy Spirit and I trust God's direction in all of this, that he gives us the ability as people to watch these things, to read these books, to read different translations, and to compare notes to say,
Discern, right?
yeah, I want to know Jesus. And this might be one more method to get a little closer to seeing him in our
Right.
lives.
That way of saying is helpful, right? It's another method to see. Just as there's been so many ways to pray. I don't know, I found recently the Eastern Orthodox tradition uses the Jesus prayer. I don't know if you've heard of that one.
Yeah.
Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And it's off of in the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector, and the tax collector is the one praying that way with his head down. He's like ashamed of himself, but he prays that way. And Jesus is like, which prayer is, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, which one's more honoring to God? And so Eastern Orthodox call it like the Jesus prayer or like the breath prayer, and they just pray it over and over, right?
Right.
And I found that prayer for me really helpful. But I've seen in the Christian tradition, there's so many ways people pray. Centering prayer, like Acts prayer that I grew up learning Acts prayer, adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplicate, but different ways to learn. Like I know some people that just do silent prayer where you just sit there and listen. And you think about that, those are traditions that we've created over time, but we believe that they're not creative in the sense of creating something that is like going against the spirit of Jesus. It's more a faithful extension,
Right.
And that's how I feel a lot about. And again, there's probably stuff that if I go back, I would probably nitpick at certain things in the series, and I think that's good. I think that's one thing I appreciate. There's some YouTube videos that shows the creator actually asking. He asked a Catholic priest, seminary evangelical seminary professor, and a Jewish scholar, how do we do?
Yeah.
He actually asked for criticism, and they're like, well, this thing like this part, and he's like, yeah, that was hard, and they thought about whether to show it in English or in Aramaic or whatever, and
Right.
and they chose English, but then they chose it like this part I didn't really like, honestly, like a little bit of like I don't even know what accent it is.
I know, yeah. That's bothered me too. It's like, what is this? What is this new accent that's being created?
They're trying to show it's different. I guess they're trying to make us as American viewers not feel that's just at home American.
But my American instinct was like, speak American. No, it's.
I was like, I can't tell where you're situated. Is this trying to be like a little bit of like, like Middle Eastern, English accent or something? But yeah, it's just. Anyways, I lost my trail of thought, but it's fast. This might be taking a different direction, but I'll say one final thing. This is going back to the whole Jesus interacting with disciples.
Yeah.
I know it's pretty early on in the story, but I find this interesting. How it depicts Jesus. I mean, we can't really know how Jesus expresses himself. Like, as one disciple says something and what's on his face, right? We just don't know.
Right.
But I find interesting it's plausible, like when you see Peter first start following Jesus. By the way, that was a moving scene, right? When he falls down and like, in the Gospels, it shows the same thing, right? He's like, I'm a sinner, um, but but it's clear to the perceptive watcher that Peter doesn't really know what kind of Messiah Jesus will be. What does it mean for Jesus to be King, Lord? And um, and his perception of what, and really, it's accurate with the Gospels because none of them really know. Even after Jesus says, "I will die and rise from the dead," they don't understand, they don't get it, right?
Right.
And he's excited to get Jesus to popularity and get his mission going. And I guess you kind of see behind this, you're imagining, because it doesn't say exactly what Peter thinks, but you're imagining he wants this guy to get as many followers and lead this movement that is gonna whatever, right? Whether it's more military or whatever style of way of becoming king, you can see it. And Jesus, you see this moment where they're walking and he says something, hey, when are we going to do this? And it's almost like Jesus does a redirect, and he does it in like a um, like you'll see kind of thing,
Right.
like hey, be patient. I don't know, he does. What I found interesting, he doesn't correct. It doesn't show him correcting it, and I thought that moment for me was profound because I'm like, huh, it doesn't show it in the Gospels, but it does show that they don't understand Jesus, and they must have asked Jesus questions along the way. And how did he react in those moments, right?
Right.
I don't know, right? But I thought that was plausible.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
you know,
It's a
it was.
great
It
example
wasn't
because
super serious at that moment. The way they depicted it, it was more like, you see, let's keep going,
right.
But
It's
yeah,
it's a
fascinating.
great example. Just like and this will be my last point as well. Just reflecting on some of that stuff. Um, yeah, like it's a good point to admit. I think, and we're both MDiv students and have been studying the Bible our whole lives, or a good portion of it. We really, really care about it, but it's worth just admitting how much we still don't know. Like you said, many people, when they read that Jesus flipped the tables and kind of whips the the crooks that are selling things in his temple, or in his father's house, they depict him as angry, or they imagine him as very angry or enraged, and he says things that you might interpret he's angry. But even still, from what a person says, their emotion might be different, right? And their actual emotions or their depictions or the whole
Body language,
range,
right?
yeah, the body language, the whole range of communication that you experience when you're actually with a person can be lost and can be misinterpreted. So it's worth saying, it could still be misinterpreted in the show,
Yeah,
but I appreciate that they are trying.
yeah.
And
Like you
there's a
don't see in the gospel, right? Like the genre of the gospels doesn't show. It's not written like modern novels, right? So it doesn't show. At
right.
that moment, Jesus, like, Jesus sat there and thought. Internally, he was thinking about how much he missed his mom,
Right.
and 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 he was also thinking about how Peter said this, and it doesn't show that, and it doesn't show like then Jesus put his hand on his disciple's shoulder and gazed into his eyes and said, but
Right.
um, uh, it's not unreasonable to think about like a loving person, a normal loving person, given his role as a traveling rabbi or whatever, right? His social role in relation to them, the way is it plausible that he would relate to them physically in this way? And then so you have to wrestle with that, and I'm like, like Jesus had to think about how he related to people in space and time, you know, and Jesus was controlling the muscles on his face. um, And that's a part of him loving people and carrying out his ministry on earth. And strangely, almost none of that is shown in the Gospels. And we have to, and I wonder, like you're saying, it's risky. I wonder, maybe this is the last thought. I wonder if we're always going to have to ask that question, because even facial expressions are so culture specific and culture bound, right? Like how we express joy and sorrow, and I know that like, for example, right, if you stare at someone too long in my neighborhood, people might, if you're constantly looking in people's eyes, people might think you're weird, right? In certain contexts, it's really inappropriate not to look someone in the disrespectful if you're not looking someone in the eye when you're talking to them, and just thinking about, like, okay, Jesus is Jewish, but he's also, like, in a really complicated cultural world. He did that, So anyways, there's so many things. Yeah. I'll say I'm fascinated. Yeah. I'm saying fascinated. I have prayed for these people that are making it. And I also had the thought, I bet a lot of people, just as a lot of people are giving money to them, I bet a lot of people are praying for these people making the series, that they do it, I don't know, that it's filled with the Spirit, that Jesus guides them, Right. So I think that both of us would say we commend it, not necessarily saying this is like this is another Bible or another authoritative text, but we highly commend it to people to check it out. Don't do the same thing we did in the beginning of just dismissing it right away. Show some openness to it. Maybe one friend we had experienced a mini revival, like they were crying the whole time through all 8 episodes, So you may find yourself drawn to Jesus more. If you don't know Jesus, if you don't consider Jesus, your whatever, Savior, Lord, someone that you follow, maybe you will find this picture of Jesus compelling and consider it, right?
Yeah. And at the very least, we've been here talking for a good amount of time, I think, about Jesus. We've been talking about Jesus, and whether this show is right or wrong in certain areas, I think at the very least it gets people talking about Jesus, and it gets them curious. It might get me to double check my New Testament a couple more times to say, does Jesus really act like that, right? And I wonder why Jesus does this here or there. And in a way, I feel closer to Jesus because of wrestling with those questions through this show. So I'm very grateful for their work, and I'll be praying for them too, because it's a powerful thing, and I hope that the Lord would bless their efforts.
Yeah, definitely.